Tonight, we are taking you inside the state's biggest fentanyl bust ever. Investigators say that the dealers used the hottest toy in town to smuggle the deadly drugs.
The biggest substance bust in the history of Minnesota just went down, and the details are absolutely wild. Federal investigators have uncovered a network so deeply embedded that it took 3,000 arrests just to scratch the surface.
Charges say that they stuffed pounds of pills inside toys called Squishmallows and then mailed them to Minnesota.
But here is the deal. While the FBI was trying to save lives, the governor was allegedly standing in their way. This operation has revealed how a specific community was targeted by traffickers while leaders looked the other way. You are about to see exactly how this network operated and why the federal government finally decided to step in. Shadow politics exposed. Federal agents have officially moved on Minnesota, and the scene is nothing short of chaotic. Law enforcement officers from the FBI and ICE swarmed the offices of Governor Tim Walz and several of the biggest mayors in the state. This massive sweep comes as more than 3,000 arrests have been made in a surge that is ripping through the Somali community. What started as a simple substance crackdown did not stay on the streets for very long. At first, agents were just arresting local dealers and pulling pills off the street, but the numbers started to grow way too fast. Seizures spiked, fatalities kept climbing, and the price of the pills collapsed to as low as $1. This is a clear sign that the supply was now deeply embedded in the community. Local law enforcement officers say they have never seen anything like it. The cheap price is now having a major impact on the opioid crisis in the Twin Cities metro area. That is when investigators realized that Minnesota had become a critical distribution hub for the entire region. But the big question is, who was actually in charge of that hub? As the federal authorities expanded their operations, arrests surged into the thousands. Many of those were tied to distribution networks concentrated inside the Somali community. But here is the bizarre part. As the federal agents went after the suspects, they were blocked by top Minnesota officials. This included Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Jacob Frey, who appeared to be protecting the individuals the feds were trying to catch. They publicly condemned the operation and told the feds to leave. They even warned residents to resist and document the arrests. The government claimed they had brought down crime, but federal investigators saw a different story. They were looking at thousands of hardened criminals who were still on the loose. However, the federal government was not backing down. Instead, they sent the FBI after those very officials to see what was really going on. What they found blew the whole investigation wide open and revealed some shocking information about why the substance problem got this bad in the first place. By the time federal agents stepped in, Minnesota was already flashing red. It all started with the pills. Street teams kept finding them in places where they had never been seen before. It was not just during big raids, but also during routine traffic stops and small apartment searches. All of a sudden, it was everywhere. People could literally walk down any street in Minneapolis and find it within 10 minutes. But what happened next was what really raised alarms for federal officials. The price dropped so low it was hard to believe. Investigators started hearing the same thing from every corner of the state. The synthetic substance was selling for $1 to $2 a pill. It became dangerously cheap. A longtime county sheriff investigator confirmed that the price in the metro area was down from $20 just a couple of years ago. That kind of drop is not normal at all, and cheap substances do not mean people want them less. In fact, it usually means the supply is way too easy to get. For years, this has been the choice for the black market, and dealers found easy ways to make it on the street. Everything seemed to be moving according to a plan that the federal government was finally starting to understand. The underground marketplace. The massive increase in supply can only mean one thing, and that is a rise in emergency calls. When investigators looked at the data, one trend stood out more than any other. Fatalities were climbing fastest inside the Somali community of Minnesota, especially among the young people. Leaders say young residents are passing away at a record and heartbreaking rate. While that does not mean the community caused the crisis, it does mean the problem has buried itself deep inside those neighborhoods. To get to the bottom of it, task forces were sent out into the streets to conduct buy and bust operations. This gives the agents a second chance to seize the narcotics after they have already entered the United States. Here's what typically happens in those operations. The agents trick the traffickers into meeting with an undercover officer. The undercover officer acts like a substance trafficker who wants to buy a huge amount of narcotics. These officers work for years setting up deals and locations with traffickers from Mexico and all over the United States. Once the undercover officer confirms the substances are there, they say a secret word and the agents move in to make the arrest. Soon enough, the same names and phone numbers started popping up over and over again. These names appeared at different street corners on different days with different officers. What looked like random busts started fitting together like a giant puzzle. That is when they got the full picture. Minnesota was not just a place for substances to pass through on the highway. Investigators concluded that Minnesota had become a major distribution hub. The purpose of these traffickers is to sell bulk amounts that would later be broken down and sold in smaller amounts by local dealers. The substances were being stored, repackaged, and replaced constantly. Every time an agency pulled one dealer off the street, another one was ready to take their place. With this new information, the mission changed. The FBI was brought in to dismantle the entire network as part of Operation Metro Surge. They mapped out phones, tracked money trails, and checked arrest records. As the arrests swept through the state, investigators noticed patterns. The same circles of people were being arrested week after week. The numbers started to stack up. First it was 100, then 500, and eventually over 1,000. By the time the operation was at full speed, more than 3,000 arrests were recorded. Minnesota was no longer just fighting a problem, it was completely drowning in it. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming for the local courts. But as the federal pressure increased, the local politicians began to make some very loud noises. Political walls and legal battles. By the time the federal arrest numbers were released to the public, Minnesota was at its breaking point. Thousands of arrests were discussed in public briefings. Even the highest levels of the national government chimed in, calling the individuals arrested some of the worst characters anyone had ever seen. They described them as brutal individuals who were making the streets unsafe. These were not just small-time offenders, but people with long criminal histories and violent charges. But as the number of arrests climbed toward 3,000, something very unexpected happened. The people in power at the state and city level began pushing back with a lot of force. The governor and the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul all publicly criticized the federal tactics. They did not just talk about the arrests, but they complained about how they were being done. They said the presence of federal agents was making communities feel unsafe and disrupting everyday life for normal people. They claimed agents were breaking windows and dragging people down the street with no warning or due process. They even called it kidnapping. In response, the federal government explained that it was a very chaotic scene and that law enforcement officers were facing a lot of violence against them. They claimed there was a highly coordinated campaign to stop them from doing their jobs. Nobody was buying the excuses from the local leaders, though. It got so bad that local lawsuits were filed against the federal government. Civil rights concerns were raised and protests started to flare up. Federal authorities took notice because these protests seemed to be encouraged by the Minnesota officials. The officials released statements that looked like they were trying to obstruct justice. They told residents they had a right to film agents and encouraged them to carry their phones at all times to document everything the feds were doing. Around the same time, federal prosecutors hit back by opening a new legal investigation. They wanted to know if the public statements and actions by these officials had unlawfully interfered with federal law enforcement. The United States Department of Justice issued grand jury subpoenas to 6 Minnesota officials for allegedly obstructing the investigation. Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Jacob Frey confirmed they received those orders. 4 other individuals were also summoned, including the state attorney general. These were orders to hand over records, emails, and documents connected to the operation. The investigation is still looking into whether these officials broke the law by trying to stop a federal sweep. Federal prosecutors are focusing on a possible conspiracy. Suddenly, the whole story shifted because subpoenas change everything. They allow prosecutors to look much deeper into the private files of the government. What they found in those files was something no one in the public expected to see. Toy smugglers. This is why both federal agencies surged into Minnesota in the first place. The numbers coming out of the Twin Cities were scary. Authorities are calling this the largest substance bust in the history of the state. Investigators found that dealers were using the most innocent things to hide their illegal cargo. They were taking the hottest toys in town and using them to smuggle deadly substances across the border and into neighborhoods. The Substance Enforcement Administration reported that Minnesota saw a record number of pills seized in 2023. The numbers were way higher than any of the states nearby. It looked like people on the street were the walking dead. The DEA announced they seized over 417,000 pills in just 1 year. That was more than twice the number of any other state in the region. It was a jump of over 127% from the year before. This made Minnesota one of the hardest hit places in the entire Midwest, and it was not slowing down at all. Federal agents described the flow as an avalanche. Pills were showing up in city neighborhoods and even rural outposts. They were being mailed in packages right through the Postal Service. Substance distributors were trying almost anything, like mailing stuffed teddy bears to addresses in the metro area. But just seizing the substances did not stop the supply. While law enforcement was pulling them off the street, the distributors were just pushing more in. It truly was like an avalanche. The traffickers saw the police efforts and tried to counter them by simply sending more product. What was even worse was that as the seizures went up, the price kept going down. That really stood out to the FBI. That kind of price drop only happens when the supply is much larger than what the police can catch. It means the distribution network is deeply rooted. This could be seen clearly on the streets. Police in Minnesota were not just finding pills at traffic stops anymore. They were seeing them in hospitals and hearing about them in every single overdose call. The records showed that 7 out of 10 pills seized contained a dose that could be fatal. It was just getting worse every single day. This led to the hard conclusion that Minnesota was the heart of the problem for the entire region. The pills arrived there and then spread out to all the other states. The investigators were now determined to trace the supply chain back to the very beginning to find out who was really in charge. The silent crisis in the community. By the time federal investigators were counting up the arrests, another story was unfolding in living rooms and dinner tables across the state. The report showed something very unsettling. The crisis was not hitting every part of Minnesota the same way. It was tearing through specific neighborhoods much faster than others. Inside the Twin Cities, one community kept appearing in the reports over and over again. Elders in the Somali community began to sound the alarm about what was happening. They described the use and the fatalities as growing faster than anyone could keep up with. These were not just names on a paper, they were sons and neighbors and classmates. One mother described how her son seemed to have his whole life ahead of him. He had a job offer and big dreams for the future. He died the same night he came home with his offer letter. He was supposed to start his new job the very next day. Her story was not the only one. The data showed that Somali residents were passing away at more than twice the rate of other people in the state. People of color have been hit disproportionately hard by this epidemic. But what made this stand out was the incredible speed of the surge. By 2021, the number of black residents in Minneapolis losing their lives to these substances actually passed the number of white residents. Investigators noticed that the use of these substances in the Somali community spiked all at once. When a supply hits that fast, it usually means the dealers are very close by. This raised a very difficult question for the FBI. If the substances were this cheap and the fatalities were clustered so tightly, the supply had to be embedded inside the social circles of the community. The evidence in Minnesota points to a massive failure at the state level. Do you think officials were actually protecting these networks? Let us know your thoughts below. Like and subscribe.